Hey, what's up? It's me, Lex, back at you with another video. Today I'm going to be covering the social encounters system in Pathfinder 2nd Edition. Depending on how you run your games, you may or may not engage with this to the full extent that it provides you. It provides a very good framework for a balanced interpretation of being able to abstract all roleplay away, or just provide a proper guideline for when things get more intense. And it even references that in here. They say most conversations play best as free-form role-playing with maybe one or two checks or social skills involved. I would agree with this, generally speaking. Some groups might not be comfortable with role-play, however, or might not be capable with it, and the rules below do enable the party to take advantage of social encounters in a balanced and engaging way regardless. And especially with some skill feats, specifically engaging with these subsystems, it can reward investment if from time to time you utilize these rules. Anyway, to get into it, the TLDR of this bit at the top here is that social encounters for a general game are going to be the high stakes, high intensity moments when something very particular needs to happen. You're not going to want every conversation to be a social encounter, but you're not going to want to have your game be entirely devoid of them. They give a bunch of examples for social encounters. You can see this entire spread right here, like besting a rival bard in a battle of wits, brokering peace between warring groups, convincing a dragon not to eat the party, etc. The idea being that you engage with these rules when the game calls for it. Notably, it can be a little bit intimidating to get into running social rules because the level of creatures is not necessarily their non-combat level. Non-combat level is not the greatest defined term in the game. It is on GM Core page 128. It generally provides some reference of making up the statistics for a non-combat setting or encounter based not on the actual level of the creature, like a commoner being level -1, but depending on the skills that they might utilize within a social situation. And so they have an example here where judges as level -1 creatures with 9 HP, a level 1 monk could very easily obliterate a judge in hand-to-hand combat, but where the judge stands out and what makes them a level 6 creature in social encounters is that they have a +16 modifier to their legal lore, which is quite high for a level -1 creature. Generally speaking, though, if you need to pull some statistics right out of the, air, you can look specifically at the statistics that it has with its perception and will and its social skills. If it doesn't have any social skills, but it makes sense for them to in your story, then I would suggest taking some of their other skills and translating it over. So, for example, if a creature has really high athletics and really middling acrobatics, but they're meant to be a decent talker, I might take their acrobatics bonus and just translate that over to, say, they specialize more in lying. I would give that to their deception and allow them to use it that way. And notably, when you engage in a social encounter, you need to give the party XP dependent on the non-combat level of the encounter as well. Notably, because of how social encounters work, you won't always be able to utilize a full collection of creatures. It's significantly harder to have, say, one person argue with the entire party in a social encounter. They might have an advantage there that you will need to design around in a way that you wouldn't for, say, combat, something like that. So look out for that. But back to it. Just like in chases, if you watch my other video, initiative and actions for social encounters take place in initiative order, but generally you do one thing per turn. You get to make one check or do one thing. Typically this is by using a skill action, and I brought a bunch of them up to give you examples. You can use lie to fool someone with an untruth, which is a lovely piece of writing there. Shout out whoever did the work on player... My goodness. Sorry about the cat. Shout out to whoever did the writing work on Player Core page 238 for that one. You can impersonate. This isn't necessarily an action you can take actively in combat. Well, not in combat, in a social encounter. But this would be relevant to a social encounter because you would be lying to impersonate someone. And so I decided I would bring this up here. This is how you pretend to be someone or something you are not. Similarly, in the vein of impersonate and lie, I wanted to toss in gather information. This isn't directly a action that you can take in combat, but you are encouraged in social encounters to allow initiative and the rounds to take place across as much time as makes sense for the encounter. And so gather information could actually be relevant, as could impersonate, depending on the circumstances. You could be, say, running a social encounter where across the span of a couple of weeks, your party is trying to uncover the truth behind this cult, something like that. But back into the specific actions that you can make in a more personable example. We have make an impression here. You spend a minute or more of conversation to try and make people like you better. Request, where you can try to get people to do things for you if they are friendly or helpful. Coerce, where you can attempt to force people to do what you want using your intimidation. Perform, which is probably the least well defined of all of these actions, but that's kind of by the nature of what performance is. You are attempting to prove capability or impress someone. And so I would recommend, depending on the circumstances, to allow people to use skills other than performance to perform. If it's something like proving your capability, say someone is trying to say that they will only give you this job if you can prove that you are talented enough with, say, working with firearms. I would allow someone to perform using crafting to attempt to prove their capability in a situation like that. And then as far as initiative goes and acting in initiative order, the players get to roll either society or a charisma-based skill. So diplomacy, deception, performance, things like that. And you roll dependent on your approach. There's kind of an emphasis in these rules of players role-playing first and then assigning actions after the fact. I think that it relies more on your group's style of play and how well they can engage. I think that some players might find an easier time being like, I'm going to attempt to lie to them to get them to believe, and then they come up with something, rather than say they're like, oh, I'm gonna try and convince him that I fell down the well, and then you go, let me make a lie check for me, etc. Generally speaking as well, you will not be able to use abilities or spells that are immediately apparent, and especially with spells, when people see the visual signs of a spell being cast, they are likely to assume you're using magic to try to influence or harm them, and will have a negative reaction. I would highly recommend being pretty strict with this, because otherwise some spells will be able to outperform their position in balance. And then, as it says here, generally speaking, a turn goes on just long enough for a character to make one salient point and attempt one check before moving to the next character. There's not the greatest, well, well, I should rephrase. The goal and mechanics of the opposition in initiative is usually to increment a timer, the same way as with the chase rules, where whenever a round finished, the opposition forces would automatically progress. I would recommend for the social encounters rules, as it kind of gets into here with measuring success and progress, either automatically incrementing a fail state or advancing on to further points in the social encounter. You can kind of pull these rules out whenever something seems appropriate, and so it can be very helpful to learn these rules and be able to reference them quickly whenever something does arise. I have a few examples that I'll be getting into for measuring success and progress, but the go-to and easiest method is the different attitude conditions: hostile, unfriendly, indifferent, friendly, and helpful. They allow you to, just in a 5-tier system, see how someone is going. Most people will begin off indifferent, maybe some are unfriendly, maybe some are friendly. You can see what works best for you. But similarly, you can use subsystems like victory points or influence. I'm not going to go into the details of all of those, although I will have some examples for victory points. The systems include things like accumulating points towards a goal, having a set amount of points and trying to retain them with a time limit, or having parties contesting for who can obtain the most amount of victory points. And as far as bypassing encounters, so if a social encounter is bound to happen, but the party manages to circumvent it through, say, a tactical smart play, savvy diplomatic exchange, clever use of magic, or another approach that required ingenuity and planning, you award them normal XP. The idea is, if your players are engaging with the game, you want to reward them for that. Even if they manage to bypass something you prepared for them, it's always good to reward engagement. And as far as consequences go for a social encounter, it's very highly recommended, both by me and the book, to make the stakes of an encounter clear and make both progress and conclusion clear as well. Getting into the examples that I have prepared here, we're back with Tiny, our lovely little champion. He is not going to be engaging in any combat today, though. He's pulled up on the shoreline of a small island off of the southern coast of the Kortos Isle in the dead of night. And he's decided, his party has decided that they need to engage with the black market trade to progress whatever their objective is. Perhaps they're trying to infiltrate some deeper criminal organizations, but they need to make their way through the black market, purchase some goods, and they figure, hey, we might as well take advantage of it while we're here. Tiny is going to step up onto the dock and make his way along the path, the crackling fires and smoke flying out over the misty water in this dark night is quite a sight. And he pauses for a moment to listen to the sounds of his boat gently bobbing up and down in the shallower water here, before he eventually makes his way up to this door, knocks twice more for the passcode, and then opens the door and steps in. As he does, he is greeted by Winda. Winda is the dedicated kind of, not exactly head bodyguard, but some higher up in the black market organization, kind of a vetting proceeding person. So she is in default starting attitude of unfriendly. However, Tiny actually has 2 feats that are relevant to social encounters. Specifically, that will be Let me go into the feats here. Courtly graces and glad hand. Courtly graces means that Tiny was raised among nobility, which allows him to present himself as a noble. Unless he is intentionally presenting himself differently, anyone who speaks with him will assume he is a noble or closely associated with nobility. And this also allows him to use society to make an impression on a noble, as well as with impersonate to pretend to be a noble, to be of noble, or a type of noble, or a specific individual noble. Sorry, I stuttered over my words there. If he uses the normal skills in those situations, he receives a +1 circumstance bonus to the check instead. So there's a bonus whether or not he's utilizing this. He is not presenting himself as a noble in this situation. He feels that working with black market connections, they would not look too highly on a noble. Although little does he know, the noble presence in the city of Absalom is actually well tied in with the black market. They pay good for drugs and do not tend to vet the prices of what they purchase too much because they have a lot of money. And he also has the glad hand skill feats. First impressions are his strong suit. When he meets someone in a casual or social situation, he can immediately attempt a diplomacy check to make an impression on that creature instead of needing to converse for a minute. If he fails, he can then engage in a 1 minute of conversation and attempt a new check at the end of that time rather than accepting the failure or critical failure result. So in this circumstance, he's going to immediately make an impression against Winda here. He's using diplomacy, and he is going to gain a +1 circumstance bonus because he is using the normal skill with courtly graces. That, unfortunately, is a 2 on the dice, which would be a critical failure for him. But lucky, he's able to step in as his immediate impression. Perhaps the door creaks quite loudly, and Winda glances up with a glare under her brow. But Tiny manages to swiftly push himself into the room, and Glad Hand giving him the expertise in social navigation. He slides himself right into the chair on the other side of the table, and it turned out that this was perhaps a good thing. Winda actually quite respects someone who is capable of sitting at the opposite end, another head of the table, rather than sitting in one of the chairs that would put them to either side or closer to her. He engages in some light conversation. A hi, how are you? This could be role-played out, but specifically here I'm going to try to illustrate that it's not necessary to. After a minute of conversation, he can attempt to make an impression once again with that +1 circumstance bonus. This one is only a failure, which means that there is no change in her attitude towards him. At this point, she is going to interrupt his introductory discussion with questions about why he's here, what he's intending to do, etc. He does not want to give up the lead here, and so he is going to attempt to lie to her about his intentions. And that would be another 2 with a critical failure. I'm going to, for the sake of trying to demonstrate the social rules here, that's another 2. I'm going to, for the sake of trying to demonstrate the social rules here, say that rather than critically failing, he succeeds. She is going to believe his lie. And in this circumstance, he's saying that he is interested in purchasing some black market goods for hunting of exotic animals on the Cortas Isles, some illegal poaching of a dangerous beast. Special tools are required. And though she is still unfriendly to him, this success has in fact gotten him past her, and she will wave him on through the door here. As for alternative endings to this social encounter, if he had critically succeeded on the make an impression, improving her attitude by 2 steps from unfriendly to friendly, then that would have made it so that her initial impression of him was enough to simply wave him through, no questions or grilling required. If he had, in fact, critically failed the lie check against her, which means that she would not believe his lie and gain a bonus against attempts to lie for the duration of the conversation, she would also be more suspicious of him. Given these circumstances, being more suspicious of someone that you are already not particularly trustful of would have resulted in combat breaking out if Tiny did not leave the premises immediately. With that, it is important to note that the context of a social situation matters just as much, if not more, than the direct mechanics of it. And specifically with the courtly graces, as I explained, Winda is quite used to oblivious nobles coming in, just interested in getting their hands on some drugs and being able to get additional money from them because they're not particularly protective of their coin. And so if Tiny had been utilizing courtly graces, her starting attitude would have simply been indifferent, and I likely would have given Tiny bonuses on the checks, if not entire tiers of success upgrades, where even a failure would have gotten him through. Social situations, depending on the context, but in this situation, because I want the story to move forward, it's another one of those systems that you really want your players to succeed at. Anyway, with Tiny waved through, he will approach this door, open it, and enter, meeting Arnon. Arnon here is the trader who maintains all of the goods. There is a variety of them in this storehouse, and many more in this room to the south. Arnon is generally just indifferent to people, regardless of who they are. And this is to demonstrate, whereas Window was a level 6 creature that was simply utilizing the will save, or will DC, to be specific, for social encounters, Arnon is going to demonstrate that even a level -1 creature, in this case the base creature was a merchant, can have higher statistics, with a mercantile lore of +10, diplomacy of +12, and deception of +10, as well as a +10 to the will save. Arnon is in fact going to be able to stand his own in this conversation. And despite the fact that Tiny could likely kill Arnon with a single strike, Arnon is going to be considered, as far as experience goes, as maybe a 4th or 5th level creature. You can play with the specifics somewhat loosely when you're utilizing the social encounter system. In this case, Tiny is going to be attempting to gain some specific goods from Arnon, explaining what he wants, after making the glad hand impression, of course. So let us run that through quickly. A failure will go through, and with a minute of small talk, perhaps asking about various goings-on in Cortos, latching on to something that Arnon is interested in, one of the goods that he attempts to peddle more enthusiastically. And another attempt at make an impression will succeed, improving the attitude by 1 step. So now, rather than indifferent, Arnon is friendly. It must be noted as well that with the attitude effects or conditions, you should try to utilize reasonability. A creature becoming helpful towards the party specifically merchants in this case, would not mean that they would necessarily be able to or be willing to give them discounts, but they might be willing to, say, utilize their information network to send people out to gain specialist goods. They might be willing to sell some of their special product, maybe things that are not on the shelf, minor things even. Maybe the party is trying to stock up for a long journey and your impression makes them helpful. They might go into the back and pull out some of their freshest food for you, saying, oh, well, if you're going to be out for several weeks, then I'm going to give you this. Usually I sell first come, first out, so that things can stay as fresh as possible, but I don't want you to be eating food that is starting to go bad as you're making your way back into the town. In the specific situation, Arnon becoming friendly means that it's not going to take much to convince him to sell some special goods. And the two will make their way down into the special goods room where Arnon will show off some unique items, notable and not otherwise available. And at the end here, Tiny will be attempting to utilize the friendliness that he's built up against Arnon to try to get a discount. This isn't necessarily something I advise allowing all of the time, but in this case, Tiny is going to be trying to lie to Arnon about a specific item that Arnon has, that Tiny has picked out that Arnon is not all too informative about. Or not all too informed about. That'll be a deception check versus Arnon, and with a critical success, Arnon is going to believe the lie, and because Arnon is friendly, lying about the price, and it'll actually just be a normal success because I forgot to mention that it was supposed to be going against Arnon's mercantile lore DC, so that it would be more representative of his ability to judge the value of items rather than against the perception DC of telling whether or not Tiny is lying. But still a 26 would beat the DC of 20. And in this case, Tiny is going to get a 10% discount with all of the bonuses that he has stacked up because this is a reasonable situation, and I, the GM, am allowing it. Moving on now to a later point and down the map over here. Tiny has come back and forth between this location now a few times and has now ended up in a bit of trouble with the group. His cover has finally been blown and they are mad. I have an enraged mob and an angry mob to represent two different types of encounters, but in this case, Tiny is shepherded onto this small rock peeking out of this roaring river, and the mobs are filled with distaste for him. In the case of the angry mob, I'm going to be utilizing a victory point system where you need to gain a certain amount of successes before a certain amount of losses. The DC will stay as a set 22, though you could have it go up or down depending on the case. For this specific encounter, and I'm not going to be rolling initiative, although this would be when you would were there multiple players, as would you have up here. If multiple players had rolled in, you would roll initiative, and each one would take their actions before Window was then able to respond or move on to something. But in this case down here, and in all cases with Tiny being the only other participant, we're going to be ignoring the initiative portion. Tiny is going to be attempting just some simple diplomacy checks against the angry mob, attempting to get them to back down. Victory point subsystems can be particularly difficult to engage with depending on how your group enjoys the game, because being able to stack up points can work for better or for worse. In this case, we're going to be setting DC 22 with diplomacy and posting that into chat as the angry mob DC. Tiny has as many rounds as he would like, although he cannot leave the rock, to attempt to rack up 3 successes before he gains 2 losses. In this case, because they are upset about him lying, he is simply going to attempt to utilize diplomacy to talk his way out of it. With a single failure, that will mark a single failure onto the angry mob checklist there. Tiny will continue, and this time succeed. Another attempt will fail, and in this case 2 losses have been racked up before 3 successes, and Tiny has failed to convince the angry mob to back down. In this case, I have prepared moving on to an enraged mob. The mob has now kind of pulled together into an aggressive cluster, and they are starting to threaten violence. Tiny now has 5 rounds, and so in this case I will be rolling initiative for Tiny here, utilizing diplomacy, although because it's only him, it will not really matter. There we go. Tiny will have 5 rounds to gain as many victory points as he possibly can. As you can see right here, with only a critical failure losing you victory points. And there are 3 tiers of success here. If Tiny gains 3 victory points, he has a certain result. If he gains 6, he will have a better result. And if he gains 12, it'll be even better. I wouldn't necessarily recommend 3, 6, and 12 for a single party member in a normal game, but as far as a full party, this should be plenty fine, and perhaps even a little easy. But in this case, Tiny is going to be on his lonesome. For the first round of combat here, and we're going to continue to simply use a DC 22 diplomacy check. Tiny is going to try to get them to back down a little bit. With a success, that's going to gain him a victory point. And we move on to round 2, where a failure will not lose him any victory points. Round 3, failure again. Round 4, I would really like if Tiny would succeed, so I'm going to be saying he succeeds there. 2 successes and 2 failures means he has 2 points. And at round 3, another success brings him to 3 victory points. And at the end of all 5 rounds that he has been given here, he has gained enough points to match or exceed the first victory threshold, which is going to gain him the lessermost effect of they are going to simply chase him off. They start perhaps shooting some crossbow bolts, throwing some stones, but not necessarily at him, more to force him to jump into the river and swim downstream. If he had gained up to 6, then I would have given him another chance to talk the mob down. And if he had gained 12, then he would have won them over from their enraged state and been able to return. With that encounter done, and I will note here, because that was a success of any kind, even though it was not the greatest form of success at the 6 or 12 points, Tiny would receive experience for the encounter here. And with the DC being 22, I would likely say that this is level 6 or maybe even 7 creature, and 2 of them going up against Tiny, and I would have given him some decent experience. But now for the final social encounter that I've built. This is an alternate timeline here where Tiny managed to critically succeed check after check, and it was just so funny that I really had to run with it, and Tiny became the boss of the mob after maybe a year and a half. Tiny is going to have to defend his position, though, as Winda and a whole crowd of various mob members burst in on him while he is working hard at his table on his plans for the future of this black market organization. She levels her sword and declares her intentions of a mutiny. She wants to take over, and she's convinced a sizable amount of people that she is, in fact, fitting for that position. In this case, because many of these mob members are still amicable to conversation, despite the name, this is just a repurposed token. They're not necessarily ready to resort to violence. That would only be Winda here. I'm going to allow Tiny's Glad Hand to attempt to make an impression against them immediately as he spins around in his chair, and I will add the +1 circumstance bonus for the Glad Hand feat, still utilizing diplomacy, but then a -2 penalty for doing a crowd. The specific rules here do differ, but I'm trying to tell a story here. Unfortunately, that will be a failure, and the mob will remain indifferent to him. In this victory point subsystem, you start out with a certain amount of points, and you need to attempt to hold on to them. So in this case, Tiny will have 5 victory points, and across the course of 3 rounds with a DC 23 check, he is going to need to try to hold on to them. I would roll initiative here, but since it is only Tiny and no direct opposition, I see no need to. So I'll simply be putting down a DC 23 diplomacy check for defend your position into the chat here. On round 1, Tiny is going to be rolling a success, which means that he will lose no victory points. He is still at 5. On round 2, a failure goes down by 1, so he is now at 4 points. And at round 3, a critical success is going to let Tiny hold on to his position, and depending on the circumstances, this is up to GM discretion. If it is possible for you to make a comeback in the situation you're in, a critical success can gain you a point. So in this case, because the mob of people that have gotten behind Winda, thinking that she is a competent leader and willing to mutiny, is still fine with Tiny being in charge, that is going to regain a point, and Tiny will be still at 5 at the end of this social encounter. Having this back and forth with Winda, Tiny is going to convince the entire crowd that he is still the one who should be in charge, and they are going to, at his behest, perhaps he goes, "Take her away." They grab Winda, and they're going to subject her to the same on-the-rock torment as they did Tiny all those years ago. I would also note that depending on circumstances, you could pull off different types of interaction in these encounters. So say, for example, you had the charm spell, which has the subtle trait, meaning that a creature will not automatically notice you casting it. You can utilize it against a lower level creature especially to gain immense amounts of advantage against them. And so, for example, here, let me move the angry mob and move Winda back. If Tiny was a spellcaster when they met the first time, he could have walked in, sat at this end of the table, and then cast Charm on her. And as long as it was a 3rd rank spell, Winda would have not benefited from incapacitation and had to make this save. And on a failure, she would have become automatically friendly, or helpful if she was friendly. On a critical failure, she would have become helpful. And so this can be very strong. In particular, I would look out for, but allow, usually, for the ability of the spell to go off of the combat level of a creature. So, for example, here, Arnon, despite being a higher level, perhaps 5 or so creature when it comes to mercantile lore, would still be only a level -1 creature for the cases of incapacitation on Charm. This really depends. Apply it whether or not you think it is accurate to the situation. For example, I would not allow Charm on a judge, or perhaps I would, but I would have the courtroom be filled with a lot of detection magic that would catch someone attempting to utilize this in the moment. It really depends on the context of your story and what you would like to happen. Overall, I think that the social rules are quite helpful for those who are not interested in, do not want to, cannot roleplay, as well as even wanting to adjudicate encounters where you're not sure what you want to happen, but you're sure that you want something to happen. I think that social rules could do with being implemented in more situations than I have seen in general, so that the skill feats that reward investment in them, such as Tiny's Glad Hand and Courtly Graces here, could see more use. I urge you, if you are a game master, to attempt to implement them into your own games wherever possible. It doesn't need to be back-to-back constant social encounters and situations where these things would be helpful, but it can be very interesting and very engaging for your players if you do bring it up from time to time. Let me know if you have any questions in the comments down below, and let me know what you would like to see next. I will see you next time. Thanks for watching.